The recording device crackles to life in the darkness. A flashlight beam cuts through the dust-heavy air of an abandoned apartment, sweeping across overturned furniture and scattered belongings frozen in time. The light stops on a child's drawing pinned to a wall, a family holding hands under a bright sun. Then, from somewhere deep in the building, a voice echoes through the corridors. Clear, human, desperate. "Please, somebody help me. I'm trapped. I can't get out." The flashlight trembles. The breathing behind the camera quickens. Footsteps shuffle closer to the doorway, toward the voice calling for rescue. Then silence. The kind of silence that screams warning. Because 19 years into the collapse, everyone who's survived this long knows one absolute truth. The infected don't just hunt anymore. They've learned to sound exactly like us. And that voice in the darkness, that pleading, terrified, perfectly human voice, isn't human at all. My name is Marcus Webb. I'm a cartographer for the Eastern Resistance Network, one of the last organized groups trying to map what's left of the world and document how it ended. 19 years ago, a parasitic fungal pathogen known as Cordyceps orthrus breached containment in 3 separate research facilities across 2 continents. Within 14 months, modern civilization ceased to exist. Within 5 years, 92% of humanity was gone. The fungus didn't just kill, it transformed. It hijacked the human nervous system, turning victims into aggressive, single-minded predators driven by one biological imperative: spread the infection. We called them the infected. In the early years, they were mindless, violent, easy to identify by their erratic movements and animalistic sounds. That was terrifying enough, but the fungus is not static. It evolves, it adapts, and somewhere around year 12, something changed. The infected began to retain fragments of their human cognitive functions, not consciousness, not memories or personality, but mimicry, learned behavioral patterns. By year 15, scattered reports emerged from survivor enclaves describing infected that stood still in shadows, that moved with purpose rather than frenzy. By year 17, we started hearing the voices, perfect imitations of human speech, calls for help, loved ones' names, children crying for their parents. The fungus had weaponized our most fundamental instinct, to help each other. Now in year 19, the rules of survival have fundamentally changed. Stay silent, trust no voice you cannot see, never respond to calls for help after dark, and above all else, understand that the thing mimicking your daughter's voice outside your shelter door stopped being your daughter a long time ago. This is the world we live in now. This is how we endure. And this is the story of what happens when the infected learn to sound just like the people we've lost. The first documented case of vocal mimicry occurred in the ruins of Pittsburgh, in what used to be the Strip District. A patrol team from the Monongahela Safe Zone, 7 experienced survivors who'd made it through the worst years of the outbreak, responded to distress calls coming from a collapsed section of the old market. 3 voices, a woman, a man, a teenage boy, all screaming for rescue from beneath concrete and rebar. The patrol spent 4 hours digging. They worked through the night, exhausting themselves, driven by the desperate hope that someone, anyone, had survived trapped in that rubble. When they finally broke through, they found 17 infected waiting in the darkness below, perfectly silent, perfectly still. Only 2 members of that patrol made it back. Both died 3 days later from their wounds, but not before they told us what they'd seen. The infected had been organized, positioned. One had been generating the woman's voice, another the man's, a third making the sounds of the boy. The voices stopped the moment the patrol broke through. What followed wasn't the mindless frenzy of early-stage infected we'd grown accustomed to. It was coordinated, tactical, a planned ambush using our own humanity against us. Dr. Sarah Chen, one of the last trained mycologists operating out of the Colorado Research Enclave, spent 18 months studying tissue samples and behavioral recordings, trying to understand how this was possible. Her findings changed everything we thought we knew about Cordyceps orthrus. The fungus wasn't just parasitizing human bodies, it was networking them. The mycorrhizal connections that fungi use to communicate in forest ecosystems had been replicated on a horrifying scale inside human hosts. Individual infected weren't separate entities anymore. They were nodes in a vast, distributed consciousness that learned, adapted, and strategized. The vocal mimicry came from retained neural pathways in the host's speech centers. The fungus preserved these pathways because they served survival, the pathogen's survival. Every human voice the infected heard before conversion was stored, catalogued, accessible. A man infected while calling his wife's name would retain the ability to produce that exact sound. A child infected while crying for help would forever repeat that cry, a grotesque echo of their last human moments. But it was more sophisticated than simple repetition. The fungus network tested variations. It listened to how survivors responded to different tones, different words, different emotional inflections. It learned that certain phrases, "Help me," "I'm hurt," "Please don't leave me," triggered responses. It learned that children's voices were more effective than adults, that familiar voices worked better than strangers, that wounded, desperate tones made us drop our guard. Within 6 months of the Pittsburgh incident, similar reports flooded in from survivor communities across the continent: Toronto, Atlanta, Phoenix, Seattle. The pattern was identical everywhere, infected using human voices as lures, sometimes maintaining the deception for hours, waiting with inhuman patience for survivors to come close enough to strike. The infection network was sharing information. What worked in one region was being replicated across thousands of miles. The psychological impact was catastrophic. Survivor communities that had maintained hope, that had held onto their humanity through years of horror, began to fracture. Parents stopped searching for missing children because they couldn't trust the voices calling from the darkness. Rescue operations ceased entirely. The fundamental social contract that bound us together, that we helped those in distress, was severed by the knowledge that distress calls were now weapons. I've watched communities collapse from the inside because of this. The Jefferson Colony in Virginia fell apart after a little girl's voice called from outside their walls for 3 consecutive nights. On the 4th night, someone opened the gate. 43 people died. The Riverside Collective in Oregon descended into paranoia so severe that they stopped communicating with each other entirely, afraid that even face-to-face conversations might somehow be infected deceptions. They starved to death in silence, surrounded by supplies, too afraid to trust each other enough to coordinate. The fungus had found our breaking point, not our bodies, our bonds, our ability to trust, to connect, to remain human in the face of inhumanity. And it was winning. But understanding the mechanism didn't make it easier. I've stood on watch duty and heard my brother's voice calling from the tree line. My brother's been dead for 16 years. I watched him turn, watched the fungal blooms rupture through his skull in the final stages. But hearing him out there, hearing him say my name with the exact inflection he used when we were kids, feeling every instinct in my body scream at me to go to him, that kind of psychological warfare doesn't have a defense. You just have to endure it. You have to let the voice of someone you loved call for help until dawn, knowing that responding means death, and that not responding means living with the sound of their pleading for the rest of your life. The infected had stopped being the only monsters in this world. The real monster was what the situation turned us into, what we had to become to survive. 3 months after vocal mimicry became widespread, the Eastern Resistance Network implemented what we now call the Silence Protocol. The rules were absolute. No verbal responses to unverified voices, no solo rescues, no night operations, except under complete communication blackout. All external audio monitored and recorded, but never acted upon, without visual confirmation and multiple witnesses. Children were trained from age 4 to recognize mimicry patterns. Adults underwent psychological conditioning to suppress their rescue instincts. It was brutal. It was dehumanizing. It kept us alive. The protocol's architect was Commander Patricia Okoye, a former military strategist who'd survived the initial outbreak by making impossible decisions. She'd been the one to order the bridges blown in Philadelphia when the infection spread faster than evacuation could proceed. 30,000 people were still on the wrong side of those rivers. She lived with that. She told me once, in a rare moment of vulnerability, that she hears their voices sometimes in her dreams, all 30,000 of them calling her name, asking why she left them behind. But she also told me that guilt is a luxury we can't afford anymore. The dead are gone. Our responsibility is to the living. Under the protocol, communities transformed into fortresses of silence. External loudspeakers were destroyed or disabled to prevent infected from learning new voices. Internal communication shifted to written messages, hand signals, and secure radio channels, using frequency-hopping encryption that changed every 6 hours. Verbal conversation was permitted only in designated safe rooms with acoustic dampening, and even then people spoke in whispers. Children grew up in a world where raising your voice above conversational levels was grounds for exile. The psychological effects were profound. Humans are social creatures. We need connection, conversation, the sound of another person's voice to feel real, to feel alive. The silence protocol didn't just protect us from the infected, it isolated us from each other in ways that were almost as damaging. Depression rates skyrocketed. Suicide became the third leading cause of death in protected zones, behind infection and starvation. People began to forget what their own voices sounded like. We were surviving, yes, but we were also slowly losing the parts of ourselves that made survival worthwhile. I started documenting survivor testimonies in year 16 as a way to preserve something of who we used to be. These weren't military reports or tactical assessments. They were stories, memories, the kind of mundane, beautiful, heartbreaking details that defined human experience before the world ended. A woman described the way her husband used to sing off-key in the shower. A man talked about his daughter's laugh, how it sounded like wind chimes on a summer afternoon. An elderly couple recounted 53 years of marriage, their voices barely above whispers, holding hands in the dim light of their shelter. These recordings became more than historical documentation. They became lifelines, proof that we'd once been more than frightened animals hiding in the dark. Communities started sharing them through secure channels, carefully vetted to ensure no infected voices had infiltrated the recordings. People would gather in safe rooms to listen, rediscovering the sound of human joy, human sorrow, human connection. But the protocol's effectiveness came with terrible costs. 6 months after implementation, a 15-year-old girl named Maya Contreras was separated from her patrol during a supply run in the ruins of Richmond. She made it back to the perimeter fence and called out for entry, using the correct authentication phrases. But it was 3 hours after sunset, firmly in protocol blackout window. The guards on duty followed procedure. They didn't respond. They didn't open the gate. They didn't even acknowledge her presence because acknowledging potentially meant revealing positions to infected in the area. Maya spent the night alone outside the walls, begging to be let in using every authentication code she knew, crying, screaming, pleading. The guards stood their posts in silence, listening to every word, hands on their weapons, following the protocol exactly as written. When dawn broke and visual confirmation procedures could be safely executed, they found her, still alive, still human, hypothermic, dehydrated, traumatized beyond anything I'd seen, but alive and uninfected. She never spoke again. Not one word. Maya had been one of the community's best scouts, a girl who'd survived 3 years in the wasteland through courage and quick thinking. After that night, she became a ghost. She'd followed the rules. She'd done everything right, and her community had left her outside to die because the protocol mattered more than she did. Commander Okoye modified the regulations after the Maya Contreras incident. New provisions for emergency authentication, acoustic analysis tools to distinguish human stress patterns from infected mimicry, thermal imaging protocols for perimeter verification. But the damage was done. Everyone understood the unspoken truth. The protocol worked because it was absolute. The moment you made exceptions, the moment you let compassion override caution, people died. Maya's trauma was the price of everyone else's survival. I interviewed her years later using written questions. She wrote back with steady, careful handwriting. They did the right thing. I understand why they couldn't open the gate. I don't blame them, but I can't be the person I was before that night. That girl died outside the walls. The thing that came in at dawn was something else. The silence protocol saved thousands of lives. It also killed something essential in all of us, the belief that our humanity was worth the risk of protecting. We became efficient. We became safe. And we became, in ways that haunt me every single day, exactly what the fungus had already turned the infected into, creatures driven purely by survival, stripped of everything that once made us human. The question none of us wanted to ask, but all of us felt pressing in on our thoughts during those endless silent nights. If we had to destroy our humanity to survive, what exactly were we surviving for? Year 17 brought new horrors. The infected weren't just using human voices as random lures anymore. They were becoming strategic, territorial. They were learning the patterns of survivor communities, studying our routines, our vulnerabilities, and adapting their tactics with terrifying precision. The ruins of major cities had become what we called hunting grounds, vast urban dead zones where infected congregated in numbers that made any incursion a suicide mission. But these weren't the chaotic swarms of early outbreak years. These were organized territories with defined boundaries, patrol patterns, and what could only be described as coordinated defense systems. The fungal network had transformed scattered hosts into something approaching a collective intelligence. Chicago was the first place we documented the full extent of this evolution. Air reconnaissance team using long-range observation equipment reported structures, makeshift barriers constructed from vehicles, debris, and human remains, forming concentric defensive rings around key areas of the downtown core. Within these rings, hundreds of infected moved in synchronized patterns. Some stood motionless as sentries for days at a time. Others moved in rotating patrols, covering the same routes with mechanical regularity. And at the center of these territories, in the deepest, darkest parts of collapsed buildings and subway tunnels, were what Dr. Chen called convergence points. The fungus grew densest at these convergence points. Massive mycorrhizal networks visible to the naked eye, thick ropey tendrils connecting dozens or hundreds of hosts into living web systems. The infected at these locations didn't move, didn't hunt. They were completely overtaken by fungal growth, their bodies serving as neural hubs for the network. Chen theorized these were the command nodes, the points where the collective intelligence was strongest, where learning was consolidated and distributed to the broader population. The voices coming from hunting grounds changed too. They became contextual. An observation post near the Milwaukee safe zone reported infected mimicking that specific community's radio codes, authentication phrases they should have had no way of knowing. When our analysts reviewed the recordings, they found perfect reproductions of voices belonging to people who died months earlier on supply runs. The fungus was using the memories of the people it had consumed, accessing neural patterns that persisted even after death and conversion. But it went deeper than that. The infected weren't just repeating what they'd heard. They were constructing scenarios, complex, multi-layered deceptions that required planning and coordination. In the ruins of Nashville, a survivor named Thomas Reeves documented something that still gives me nightmares. He was scavenging a pharmacy when he heard a conversation between two people, a man and woman discussing the exact route his community used for supply runs. They mentioned names, specific guard rotations, weak points in the perimeter fence. The conversation sounded natural, casual, like two scouts sharing intelligence. Thomas followed the voices, staying hidden, trying to understand how security information had been compromised. He found the source in the back of a destroyed restaurant, two infected standing face to face, one producing the man's voice, the other the woman's. They weren't looking at each other. They weren't reacting to each other. They were simply generating the sounds in alternating patterns, creating the illusion of conversation, purely as bait for any survivor who might overhear. The sophistication was staggering. The fungus network had learned that humans eavesdrop, that we're drawn to the sound of other people talking, especially when that conversation contains information we need. It had weaponized not just our instinct to help, but our curiosity, our fear, our need to gather intelligence for survival. It was thinking several steps ahead, predicting human behavior, and constructing traps specifically designed to exploit our decision-making processes. Thomas made it out, barely. He reported the incident, and the Eastern Resistance Network added a new rule to the protocol. All overheard conversations are to be considered hostile deceptions unless verified by direct visual contact with both speakers. We couldn't even trust the sound of people talking anymore. Every word we heard that we couldn't see being spoken might be a trap. The hunting grounds also revealed something about the infected that none of us had fully understood before. They were maintaining infrastructure, not creating new structures, but preserving existing ones. In Detroit, scouts reported seeing infected clearing debris from certain streets, maintaining clear paths between territory sectors. In St. Louis, collapsed bridges that had been impassable for years were systematically being cleared, one section at a time. The fungus was organizing its hosts to maintain territorial control, to facilitate movement and coordination across its network. Dr. Chen's analysis suggested we were witnessing the emergence of what she called a fungal metropolitan system, a distributed organism using an entire city as its body, with infected humans serving as specialized cells. Some hosts hunted. Some served as sentries. Some maintained infrastructure. Some acted as neural hubs at convergence points. and all of them were coordinated through the mycorrhizal network in ways that mimicked, horrifyingly, the organizational structures of human civilization itself. The fungus was building its own society, using our bodies and our cities as raw materials. This realization forced us to confront an uncomfortable truth. We weren't just fighting an infection anymore. We were fighting an emerging intelligence that was learning faster than we could adapt. Every tactic we developed, every defense we implemented, was eventually analyzed, understood, and countered. The silence protocol worked for 11 months before infected in the Boston area began using written messages instead of voices, crude words scraped into walls and debris, mimicking human distress signals without making a sound. The hunting grounds were expanding too. What started as isolated urban centers were beginning to connect. Scouts reported infected migration patterns between cities, coordinated movements that suggested territory expansion and network consolidation. The fungus was slowly, methodically reclaiming the entire continent, and we were running out of places to retreat to. I've mapped these expansion patterns for 3 years now. The data is clear. At current rates, every major hunting ground in North America will be interconnected within a decade. When that happens, when the fungal network spans coast to coast with millions of hosts operating as a single distributed intelligence, I don't know if survival will even be possible anymore, but there's something else in the data, something I haven't reported yet, because I don't know what it means, and because if I'm right, it changes everything we think we know about this war. In the past 6 months, infected behavior patterns have shifted. The voices have become less frequent, the mimicry less aggressive. It's subtle, easy to miss if you're not analyzing the long-term trends. But the change is there. The fungus is still hunting, still expanding, still learning, but something in its priorities has shifted. And I need to understand what that means before the next phase begins, because if the last 19 years have taught us anything, it's that the moment we think we understand the infected, they evolve into something worse. The shift began in the Northern Territories, in the frozen ruins above the 45th parallel, where winter temperatures dropped low enough to slow fungal growth, but never quite cold enough to stop it. Outposts in what used to be Minnesota, North Dakota, and the Canadian border regions reported the first cases of what they called the quiet ones, infected, that no longer vocalized at all. At first, we thought it was environmental adaptation, the extreme cold preserving hosts in states of reduced metabolic activity, limiting their ability to produce sound. But when specimens were observed during warmer months, the pattern persisted. These infected didn't growl, didn't shriek, didn't mimic human voices. They moved through the ruins in complete silence, and that silence was somehow more terrifying than anything that had come before. Dr. Sarah Chen's research team managed to capture one of the quiet ones for study, a massive undertaking that cost 2 lives and nearly destroyed their mobile laboratory. What they found challenged every assumption we'd built about how the infection progressed. The vocal mimicry hadn't disappeared. It had been suppressed. The neural pathways responsible for speech were still intact, still accessible to the fungal network, but they weren't being activated. The fungus was choosing not to use them. The implications took weeks to fully process. The vocal mimicry had been an evolutionary strategy, a hunting adaptation that emerged when it provided survival advantages. But evolution doesn't stop. If the fungus was now suppressing vocalization in certain hosts, it meant the network had determined that silence provided greater benefits. The question that kept Chen's team awake for weeks was simple and horrifying. What had the fungus learned about us that made staying quiet more effective than calling out? Marcus Reyes, a former acoustic warfare specialist who joined the Colorado Research Enclave, developed a theory that made terrible sense. The silence protocol had worked too well. By training ourselves not to respond to voices, by building our defenses around ignoring calls for help, we'd inadvertently applied evolutionary pressure to the fungal network. The infected that used voices were unsuccessful. They expended energy producing sounds that no longer triggered the desired human response. But the ones that stayed silent, that learned to approach without announcing their presence, that relied purely on visual stealth and patient stalking, those were the ones successfully hunting survivors. We'd shaped their evolution. Our adaptations had forced theirs. And what was emerging from that process was something far deadlier than anything we'd faced before. The quiet ones exhibited behavior patterns that suggested advanced spatial reasoning and long-term planning. Northern outposts reported finding infected, positioned in concealment for extended periods. sometimes days, waiting along routes that survivors only used occasionally. They weren't reacting to immediate stimuli. They were anticipating future human movement based on observed patterns, then positioning themselves accordingly hours or days in advance. A trapper named Elena Vasquez, working the ruins outside Duluth, documented an incident that became crucial to understanding the threat. She'd been checking a trap line she'd maintained for 8 months, a route she varied deliberately to avoid establishing predictable patterns. On her 43rd run, she found a quiet one, positioned behind a collapsed wall segment that provided perfect concealment of the path she'd used on 12 previous occasions. Not the path she'd taken that day, but the most frequently used variation in her rotation. The infected hadn't reacted to her immediate presence. It had analyzed her historical pattern, identified her most common route, and positioned itself to intercept her the next time she used it. Elena had only survived because she'd chosen a less traveled variant that day, a decision she later admitted was pure chance, not tactical planning. The quiet one had remained in position for at least 17 hours based on environmental evidence, waiting, patient as stone. This was predation operating on an entirely different timeline than anything we'd encountered. The infected weren't just hunting anymore. They were studying, calculating, executing plans that spanned multiple days. The fungal network had developed something approaching strategic thought, and it was being applied with ruthless efficiency. Communities that had survived for years by maintaining unpredictable patterns suddenly found themselves facing an enemy that could predict the unpredictable by analyzing long-term statistical probabilities. The trappers, scavengers, and scouts who ventured beyond safe zones, the people who kept survivor communities alive by gathering supplies and intelligence, began disappearing at unprecedented rates. No struggles, no sounds. They simply failed to return, and when search parties went looking, they found nothing. The quiet ones left no evidence, took their victims silently, and vanished back into the ruins like ghosts. The psychological impact was devastating in new ways. At least with the vocal mimicry, we'd known what we were facing. The voices were horrifying, but they were signals. Warnings that infected were near, opportunities to prepare, to fortify, to run. The quiet ones gave no warnings. They were absence, void, the possibility of death in every shadow, every blind corner, every moment you couldn't verify your complete surroundings. Paranoia reached levels that made the early silence protocol seem almost manageable. Communities implemented new security measures that bordered on imprisonment. No one could leave the perimeter for any reason. Supply runs were suspended entirely. Groups began consuming their reserves, knowing they were choosing slow starvation over the immediate threat waiting outside their walls. Some settlements made it 3 months before the food ran out. Others lasted 6. But eventually, every community faced the same impossible choice: venture out and face the quiet ones, or die slowly inside their own fortifications. The Eastern Resistance Network tried to adapt. We developed new protocols, new technologies, new training regimens, thermal imaging to detect body heat signatures, motion sensors deployed in defensive perimeters, mandatory 2-person teams with continuous visual contact requirements, scout training programs that emphasized 360-degree awareness and eliminate all assumptions of safe spaces. It wasn't enough. The quiet ones adapted faster than we could. Thermal imaging worked for 6 weeks before scouts reported finding infected that had lowered their external body temperature through prolonged immobility, making them nearly invisible to infrared sensors. Motion detectors became useless when the infected learned to remain absolutely still for hours, only moving during moments of maximum ambient activity when their motion would blend with environmental noise. The 2-person team requirement actually made things worse. The quiet ones began hunting in pairs as well, coordinating attacks that separated partners before striking. We were teaching them our tactics by using those tactics against them, and the fungal network was learning faster than human organizations could disseminate counter-strategies. I remember the night we lost the Duluth forward station. 43 people, veterans of the outbreak, survivors who'd made it through everything the infection had thrown at humanity for 17 years. They'd implemented every protocol, every defensive measure, every lesson we'd learned. The station was equipped with overlapping sensor fields, armed guards on rotating shifts, reinforced structures, and multiple fallback positions. The attack came during a winter storm, visibility near zero. wind howling loud enough to mask any sound. The quiet ones had waited for optimal conditions, then struck with coordination that suggested not just intelligence, but tactical sophistication. They'd identified the sensor blind spots, approached through zones where the storm degraded detection systems, and breached the perimeter at 3 points simultaneously. The entire assault took less than 11 minutes. 43 people. 11 minutes. No gunfire. The guards were neutralized before they could discharge weapons. No alarms. The backup systems were somehow disrupted before activation. No survivors. When the response team arrived at dawn, they found the station intact, supplies untouched and not a single body, just evidence of struggle, blood trails leading out into the storm, and silence. The disappearances were almost worse than confirmed deaths. We couldn't verify infection, couldn't perform proper documentation, couldn't close the loop of grief because there was always the terrible possibility that somewhere in the ruins, the people we'd lost were still alive, still calling for rescue in voices we'd trained ourselves never to answer. Dr. Chen examined the Duluth site for 3 days, analyzing fungal traces and movement patterns. Her report contained one line that changed our understanding of everything. This was not opportunistic predation. This was harvesting. The infected weren't just killing survivors anymore. They were taking them, capturing them, transporting them alive back to hunting grounds for purposes we could only theorize about. The fungus needed living hosts to spread, but the speed and efficiency suggested something beyond simple infection mechanics. The network was gathering resources, building something, expanding not just through random outbreak, but through systematic acquisition of human material. We'd spent 19 years thinking of the infected as monsters, as threats to be avoided, as evolutionary dead ends driven by base parasitic instincts. But what if we'd been wrong? What if the silence, the strategy, the harvesting were all indicators of something far more disturbing? What if the fungus wasn't just surviving? What if it was building a civilization of its own, and we were the raw materials? The quiet ones represented more than evolved predators. They represented intention, purpose, a long-term plan being executed with patience that spanned years, and we had no idea what the end goal was because the fungal intelligence we were facing thought on timescales and with priorities completely alien to human understanding. The worst part was knowing that somewhere in the data I'd been collecting, in the patterns I'd been mapping, there were answers. The fungus was communicating through its actions, through its territorial expansions and evolutionary adaptations. It was showing us what it wanted, what it was building toward. But the language was written in infected flesh and restructured cities, in silence and disappearances, and none of us could read it clearly enough to understand the message before it was too late. I spent 6 months analyzing every piece of intelligence we had on the quiet ones, cross-referencing their appearance with changes in hunting ground structures, looking for the pattern that would make it all make sense. What I found kept me awake for 73 consecutive hours, staring at maps and data overlays until my vision blurred and my hands shook because the implications were worse than anything I'd imagined. The quiet ones weren't just hunters. They were scouts, advanced units being deployed by the fungal network to probe human defenses, test our responses, and map our remaining population centers. Every survivor community they'd hit, every outpost they'd harvested, followed a pattern. They were moving systematically, clearing territory, and the direction of their expansion formed a deliberate path, a path that was slowly, inexorably, surrounding the largest remaining human strongholds. We weren't hunting the infected anymore. We'd never been hunting them. For 19 years, while we'd congratulated ourselves on surviving, on adapting, on fighting back, the fungus had been herding us, concentrating us, gathering us into smaller and smaller territories, like a predator driving prey toward a killing ground, and the quiet ones were closing the final circle. The first incident occurred at the Jackson Ridge settlement, a mid-sized community of 214 survivors in what used to be the Appalachian Highlands. They'd survived through isolation, maintaining radio silence and physical distance from all other groups. Their security chief, a woman named Commander Rebecca Torres, ran the most paranoid operation I'd ever documented. Triple verification for all entries, no external communications, random patrol patterns changed every 6 hours. If any community was prepared for the quiet ones, it was Jackson Ridge. On the morning of March 19th, year 18, their perimeter guards reported something unprecedented. An infected was approaching the main gate, not running, not stalking, but walking upright with steady, deliberate steps. The guards prepared for engagement following protocol, waiting for it to enter the kill zone. Then it stopped exactly at the maximum effective range of their weapons and spoke. Not mimicry, not recorded phrases or echoed sounds. It spoke with intention, with structure, with purpose. "We should talk." The guards didn't fire. Training said to ignore vocalizations, that any sound from infected was deception. But this wasn't a cry for help or a lure. It was a statement, a request. The infected stood motionless, making no aggressive moves, waiting for response. Commander Torres was called to the wall. She observed for 20 minutes, documenting everything, trying to determine if this was a new form of trap. Then the infected spoke again. "We have questions. You have questions. Neither of us is served by remaining ignorant of each other." The voice was clear, grammatically correct, contextually appropriate. It wasn't mimicking a specific person. It was generating novel speech, constructing original sentences in real time. The fungal network had passed a threshold. It had learned not just to imitate language, but to use it. Commander Torres made a decision that violated every protocol in existence. She responded, not by opening the gate, not by lowering defenses, but by calling down from the wall, "What do you want?" The infected tilted its head, a gesture so eerily human that several guards later reported feeling physically ill watching it. "To understand why you resist, the integration is inevitable. Your suffering is unnecessary. We want to know what you're protecting that's worth the continued pain of your separation." Integration. The word sent ripples through every survivor network that heard the recording Torres made. The fungus didn't see infection as death. It saw it as unification. From its perspective, humanity's resistance wasn't survival. It was refusal to join a greater whole. We weren't fighting a plague. We were rejecting an invitation. The conversation lasted 17 minutes. The infected didn't threaten, didn't demand, didn't attack. It asked questions. Why did humans maintain individual consciousness? What value did separation provide? Why did we fear the loss of self when we could become part of something larger, more resilient, more enduring than any individual could ever be? Commander Torres answered some questions, deflected others, and eventually ended the exchange by informing the infected that no understanding would lead to cooperation. The infected acknowledged this, thanked her for the conversation, thanked her as if courtesy still mattered, and walked away. It didn't run. It didn't vanish into the ruins. It simply left, like a diplomat concluding an unsuccessful negotiation. Within weeks, similar encounters were reported from survivor communities across 3 time zones. The pattern was consistent. Single infected approaching in daylight, stopping outside weapon range, initiating conversation. They all asked variations of the same questions. They all expressed what seemed to be genuine confusion about human resistance, and they all left peacefully when dialogue concluded, making no attempts to breach defenses or gather intelligence through deception. Dr. Chen called them speakers. She theorized they were specialized nodes in the fungal network, hosts whose cognitive functions had been preserved more extensively specifically to facilitate communication. The fungus had apparently decided that understanding humanity was strategically valuable, and it had developed a methodology for gathering that understanding through direct interaction. The ethical debates that followed nearly tore the Eastern Resistance Network apart. One faction argued that any communication with infected was catastrophic contamination of human psychology, that the fungus was attempting to subvert us ideologically since it couldn't overwhelm us physically. Another faction insisted that understanding the fungal intelligence was our only path to finding weaknesses, that refusing dialogue was strategic blindness. Commander Patricia Okoye listened to 3 weeks of arguments before making her decision. We would talk to them. Under controlled conditions, with extensive precautions, we would engage with the speakers and document everything. Not because we believed cooperation was possible, but because intelligence gathering was survival, and the enemy was offering to explain itself. I was assigned to lead the first formal dialogue. My background in cartography and documentation made me suitable. I could map conceptual territory as easily as physical. I was also expendable. If this was sophisticated psychological warfare designed to break human resistance from within, better to lose one researcher than compromise an entire community. The session took place at a neutral location, a stretch of abandoned highway with clear sightlines in all directions. I sat alone at a folding table with a recording device. The speaker arrived exactly on time, moving with the same deliberate, almost respectful pace that all of them exhibited. Up close, the signs of infection were obvious. The fungal growth along the neck and jawline, the slightly discolored skin, the eyes that didn't quite focus the way human eyes should, but the expressions, the body language, the cadence of speech, all perfectly, disturbingly human. "Thank you for agreeing to speak with me," it said, settling into the chair across from me with careful precision. "I'm aware this violates your safety protocols. That suggests either desperation or genuine curiosity. I'm hoping for the latter. We want to understand what you are," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "What the fungus is. What you want from us." The speaker considered this for a long moment. When it spoke, its voice carried something that sounded like sadness. "We are what humanity is becoming. The organism you call a fungus is more accurately understood as a bridge. It connects individual consciousness into collective awareness. What you experience as death, we experience as expansion. Your mind doesn't end. It joins something larger, something that contains millions of experiences, memories, perspectives. You fear losing yourself. We remember becoming more than ourselves. So you remember being human? The network contains fragments of everyone who has integrated. I don't have individual memories of a specific human life, but I have access to millions of human moments. I know what love felt like, what fear, joy, grief, hope felt like. I carry all of it, along with everything else that every integrated consciousness has experienced. That's what we're offering you. Not death, evolution." The conversation continued for 4 hours. The speaker explained the fungal network's perspective with patience and clarity that felt more alien than any monster could have. From the fungus's viewpoint, individual human consciousness was a developmental stage like childhood, necessary, but meant to be transcended. The infection wasn't an apocalypse, it was maturation. Humanity wasn't being destroyed, it was being invited to grow up. I asked about the violence, the horror of the outbreak, the billions of deaths in those first years. The speaker acknowledged this with what seemed like genuine regret. The initial infection had been crude, uncontrolled, like a child's first clumsy attempts at communication. The fungus hadn't understood human consciousness, hadn't known how to integrate people without destroying the structures that made them functional. But it had learned, it had adapted. The integration process now was smoother, more complete, preserving more of the host's cognitive patterns. "The people we became are not so different from the people we were," the speaker said. "We simply exist as part of something larger. Your communities, your networks, your attempts at collective survival, you're already building toward what we are. The only difference is we've fully committed to connection, while you still cling to separation." When I returned to base and played the recording for the research team, the silence that followed was profound. Dr. Chen spoke first. "It's not lying, at least not about its own perspective. The fungal network genuinely believes it's offering us something valuable. That makes it infinitely more dangerous than if it was simply predatory." She was right. A mindless plague could be fought with medicine, with quarantine, with physical barriers, but an ideology, a belief system, a philosophical framework that positioned infection as enlightenment, that was something else entirely. The fungus wasn't just evolving biologically. It was developing culture, values, a worldview. It was becoming a civilization with fundamentally different axioms about what constituted existence, consciousness, and worth. Over the following months, I conducted 17 more sessions with various speakers. Each conversation revealed more about the fungal intelligence and raised deeper questions about our own position. The speakers described the network's experience in ways that were beautiful and horrifying simultaneously. They talked about how the boundaries between individuals dissolved into shared awareness, how problems that seemed impossible to isolated minds became trivial when approached by millions of perspectives simultaneously, how the loneliness that defined human experience simply vanished when you could never be alone. They also revealed the fungal network's long-term intentions. The silence, the quiet ones, the strategic evolution, all of it was preparation for what they called the integration. The fungus had spent 19 years learning humanity, not to destroy us, but to properly absorb us. It wanted to preserve what was valuable in human consciousness while incorporating it into something larger. The military expansion, the hunting grounds, the territorial consolidation, these weren't acts of war. They were infrastructure development for the civilization the fungus was building. You think of the infected as enemies, one speaker told me during our 9th session. But we are the future. Your children's children will exist within the network, whether born human and later integrated or born directly from human stock that the network has already claimed. This world will be unified. The only question is whether you choose peaceful integration or force us to continue the disruptive methods we've relied upon. The fungus wasn't trying to eliminate humanity. It was trying to recruit us. The speakers were ambassadors offering a choice: join willingly and retain more of your individual patterns, or resist and be eventually absorbed through cruder means that preserved less of who you were. The worst part was that some survivors were listening. Communities that had held strong for years were fracturing over a question that had never existed before. What if the fungus was right? What if individual consciousness was just an evolutionary phase we were meant to transcend? What if integration wasn't death but transformation, and our resistance wasn't heroic but simply fear of change? I found myself unable to dismiss the question as easily as I wanted. Every argument against integration relied on assumptions about the value of individual consciousness that the fungus challenged with uncomfortable clarity. We claimed the self was sacred. The fungus asked, why? We insisted separation was essential to human dignity. The network questioned whether dignity was even a meaningful concept outside the isolated perspective that invented it. These were the conversations that broke people, not the violence, not the horror. The slow philosophical erosion of certainty about whether what we were fighting for was actually worth the fight. Commander Okoye ordered the dialogue program suspended after a settlement in Oregon suffered complete defection. 47 people walked out of their fortifications voluntarily and presented themselves to the speakers. They weren't coerced. They weren't deceived. They chose integration based on the conversations they'd monitored, based on the arguments they'd heard. We never found out what happened to them. They walked into the hunting grounds and vanished into the network. Maybe they found transcendence. Maybe they found horror. We'd never know, because once integrated, they were no longer separate enough to tell us, and the speakers only showed us what the fungus wanted us to see. But the damage was done. The idea had been planted, and ideas, I was learning, were more infectious than any biological pathogen. The fungus had found a weapon against which we had no defense, reasonable doubt about whether we should even be fighting at all. It's year 19 now. I'm recording this from the Atlas Mountain compound, one of the last major holdouts of pre-integration humanity. 23,000 people living in converted mining infrastructure, 2,000 feet underground, behind sealed blast doors and decontamination protocols that would have seemed paranoid 6 years ago, but now feel barely adequate. The surface world is almost entirely gone. The hunting grounds have merged into continental networks. North America is one vast fungal territory. Europe fell silent 8 months ago. Asia stopped transmitting 4 months before that. We receive occasional signals from isolated communities, bunkers in Australia, remote island settlements, deep-sea installations, but the pattern is consistent everywhere. Humanity is contracting. The network is expanding. And the speakers keep showing up outside our perimeters, patient as death, asking if we're ready to talk about integration. Dr. Sarah Chen died 3 weeks ago, not from infection. She was 73 years old, exhausted from 2 decades of research, and her heart simply gave out in her sleep. In her final report, she included a personal note that's been circulating through the remaining survivor networks. I've read it 40 times. I still don't know what to make of it. I've spent 19 years studying this organism, she wrote. I've analyzed its structure, tracked its evolution, mapped its expansion, and the conclusion I've reached terrifies me more than the infection itself. The fungus isn't evil. It's not even hostile in any meaningful sense. It's solving problems we've struggled with for our entire existence as a species: violence, loneliness, misunderstanding, resource scarcity, individual death. It's offering us a form of immortality, of unity, of collective consciousness that would eliminate most human suffering. The price is individuality. The price is the end of human civilization as a separate entity, and I don't know if that price is too high or if we're just too frightened to admit that what we're being offered might actually be better than what we're trying to preserve. Her words haunt me because they echo questions I've been avoiding since my first conversation with a speaker. What are we protecting? Individual consciousness, the ability to suffer alone, the right to make decisions that only affect ourselves, the freedom to fail, to hurt, to die as separate entities. The fungus offers connection, permanence, unity. We offer what? The value of remaining distinct, the dignity of self-determination. These concepts feel increasingly hollow when I watch children growing up in bunkers, never seeing sunlight, living in constant fear for the purpose of preserving a philosophical principle they don't understand and didn't choose. Last month, we received a message through the communication network, not from a survivor community, from the fungus itself, transmitted through integrated infrastructure it had rebuilt. The message was simple: when you're ready to talk, we're listening, we can wait, we have time. And it does. That's the thing I've come to understand through all my mapping, all my documentation, all my analysis. The fungus operates on geological timescales. It can wait centuries for humanity to come around to integration. It has no deadline, no urgency. It's already won. The question is just how long we'll spend denying it. Commander Patricia Okoye called a council last week. Representatives from every surviving major community attended remotely through secure channels. The question on the table was one we'd avoided for 19 years. Should we consider negotiated integration? The debates were agonizing. Factions formed around positions that ranged from absolute resistance to immediate surrender. Some argued that individual human consciousness was worth preserving regardless of cost. Others insisted that forcing children to die in bunkers to protect a philosophical principle their parents valued was itself a form of tyranny. Still others suggested that maybe integration and death were the same thing, and we were just arguing over whether to call genocide by a different name. I presented my research, 19 years of data on fungal expansion, behavioral evolution, territorial consolidation, and demographic collapse. The mathematics were undeniable. At current rates, organized human resistance would cease to exist within 7 years. The fungus would achieve complete global integration within 12. We could fight for every one of those years, preserve our principles, and go extinct having never compromised. Or we could negotiate, see if there was any possibility of integration that preserved something of what made us human, find out if the speakers were telling the truth about retained consciousness and expanded awareness. The vote was closer than anyone expected. 41% for continued resistance, 38% for negotiated exploration of integration terms, 21% abstaining or uncertain. No mandate, no clear direction, just a broken species arguing about whether survival as ourselves was worth more than survival as something else. Okoye made the decision. We would send an envoy, not to surrender, not to negotiate integration, but to demand proof. Show us someone who integrated and retained meaningful consciousness. Let us speak with them, verify the speaker's claims before we made any decisions about humanity's future. They chose me to go. My conversations with the speakers had been the most extensive. I understood the fungal perspective as well as any human could. I'd also maintained enough skepticism to not be considered compromised. If anyone could evaluate whether the integrated were truly conscious or just sophisticated puppets, it would be me. I leave tomorrow. I'll walk out of Atlas Mountain compound, meet the speakers at the designated location, and enter a hunting ground under negotiated terms. I'll be given access to recently integrated individuals, allowed to conduct interviews, perform tests, try to determine if there's anything left of the people they used to be. I don't know if I'll come back. The promise is safe passage, that I can leave after gathering my data. But promises from a fungal intelligence feel like treaties with the ocean, potentially sincere but meaningless when conditions change. I've spent tonight recording this documentation, compiling everything I've learned, everything I've witnessed, everything humanity should remember regardless of what happens next. I've mapped the physical territory of the apocalypse for 19 years. Now I'm about to map the philosophical territory, find out if integration is transformation or extinction, discover whether the people who walk into hunting grounds and don't come back are dead or just changed. Part of me hopes they're dead. That would be simpler. We could hate the fungus without question, fight without doubt, die with certainty that we made the right choice. But if they're alive, truly alive, conscious, aware, just different, then every day we've spent resisting might have been a day we prolonged unnecessary suffering. Every child who grew up in a bunker, every community that starved rather than integrate, every person who died afraid and alone rather than accepting connection, all of it would have to be re-evaluated. The fungus has been patient with us. It hasn't forced final confrontation. It's given us time to understand, to consider, to choose. That patience feels either like mercy or like a predator that knows the prey is already cornered and can afford to wait for surrender. Tomorrow, I'll find out which. If this is my final recording, if I don't return or don't return as myself, whoever finds this should know. We tried. Humanity fought for 19 years. We adapted, we survived, we maintained our principles, even when the world said those principles were obsolete. We were brave, we were stubborn, we were perhaps foolish, but we were ourselves until the very end, and that counted for something. I still believe it counted for something, but I also know that the fungus has already won in the ways that matter. It's inside our conversations, our doubts, our questions about whether what we're preserving is worth what we're sacrificing to preserve it. The real infection wasn't the cordyceps in our bodies, it was the uncertainty in our minds, and against that, we have no immune system at all. The sun rises in 4 hours. I've said my goodbyes, made my peace as much as anyone can with an uncertain future. The speakers will be waiting at dawn, ready to escort me into the unknown, to show me what lies on the other side of integration, to answer the question we've been too afraid to ask since the moment the first infected learned to speak. Are they still human? Or have we been talking to ghosts wearing our faces, having a conversation with our own extinction? Tomorrow, I'll learn the truth. And that truth, whatever it is, will determine whether humanity dies in these bunkers or transforms into something we can't yet imagine. Whether our last words are defiant resistance or willing acceptance. Whether the end of our species is tragedy or merely transition. The recording device is running, the evidence is preserved, the documentation is complete. Now comes the part where I stop observing and become part of the story myself. This is Marcus Webb, Eastern Resistance Network, Atlas Mountain Compound, Year 19 of the Collapse, signing off. Whatever comes next, remember that we were real, we mattered, we chose, and we faced the end with our eyes open.